Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we journey into the frost-touched realm of Norse mythology, where ice meets fire, where gods walk among mortals, and where the end of all things is written in the stars themselves. As always, let me know where in the world you're listening from. Settle in beneath whatever sky covers you tonight, and let us begin. In the beginning, there was nothing. Not the kind of nothing modern minds imagine, empty space waiting to be filled, but something older, deeper, more absolute. The Norse called it Ginnungagap, the yawning void, a chasm so vast that neither thought nor dream could cross it. It was not darkness, for darkness implies light somewhere beyond. It was not cold, for cold requires warmth to define it. It simply was not, and in that nothingness, everything waited to be born. To the north of this void lay Niflheim, the realm of ice and mist, where 11 rivers called the Ilivigar flowed from the spring Hvergelmir. These were not waters as we know them, but primordial streams that carried the essence of creation itself. As they flowed away from their source, they froze, layer upon layer, until towering glaciers filled the northern edge of Ginnungagap with ice that groaned and whispered in languages not yet spoken. To the south burned Muspelheim, the realm of fire, guarded by Surtur, who sat with his flaming sword across his knees, waiting. The heat from this realm sent waves of warmth across the void, and where the ice of Niflheim met the fire of Muspelheim, something stirred. Steam rose, and in that steam, in the marriage of ice and flame, the first life took form. From the melting ice came Ymir, the first giant, the ancestor of all who would follow. He was vast beyond measure, ancient beyond counting, neither good nor evil but simply primal. As he slept in the growing warmth, he sweated, and from his sweat came more giants. From his left armpit, a man and woman, from his feet, a six-headed son. These were the frost giants, the Jotuns, beings of tremendous power and ancient wisdom who would both aid and oppose the gods throughout all the ages to come. But Ymir was not alone in that first awakening. The melting ice also revealed Aumbla, the primeval cow, who licked the salty ice blocks and freed the first god. On the first day, hair appeared where she licked. On the second day, a head emerged. On the third day, the entire figure of Buri stepped free, beautiful and strong, the first of the Aesir. Buri had a son, Bor, who married Bestla, daughter of the giant Blorn. From their union came 3 brothers who would reshape the cosmos: Odin, Vili, and Vi. These 3 looked upon the sleeping Ymir and saw not a creator but a barrier to creation. In him lay the potential for all things, but he was content to sleep and sweat and dream. The world needed more than dreams. It needed structure, beauty, purpose. So the 3 brothers killed Ymir. His death was the birth of everything. From his flesh they shaped Midgard, the world of men. From his blood they formed the seas and lakes. His bones became mountains, his teeth and broken bones became rocks and stones. His skull they lifted high to become the dome of the sky, placing a dwarf at each corner, Nordri, Sudri, Austri, and Vestri, to hold it aloft. His brains they scattered to become clouds, and from his eyebrows they built a wall around Midgard to protect it from the giants who dwelt beyond. But the cosmos needed more than earth and sea and sky. It needed light, time, the rhythm of days and seasons. The brothers took sparks and glowing embers from Muspelheim and cast them into the sky to become stars. To the brightest lights they gave special purpose. Sol, the sun, would drive her chariot across the heavens each day, pursued by the wolf skull. Mani, the moon, would follow his own path, chased by the wolf Hati. Day and night were given horses and chariots of their own, racing across the world to bring light and darkness in their proper turns. At the center of all creation, the brothers planted an enormous ash tree, Yggdrasil, the world tree, whose roots reached into 3 wells of wisdom and whose branches sheltered 9 realms. This was not merely a tree but the axis of existence itself, the pillar that held all worlds in their proper places. In its branches lived an eagle whose name was never spoken. At its roots coiled Nhggr, a dragon who gnawed eternally at the tree's base. Between them ran Ratatoskr, a squirrel who carried insults and gossip from below to above and back again, sowing discord for reasons known only to himself. The 3 wells that nourished Yggdrasil were places of tremendous power. Urbranr, the well of fate, lay beneath the root that stretched into Asgard. There dwelt the 3 Norns, Verandi, and Skuld, who ruled the fates of gods and men alike. Each day they drew water from the well and mixed it with clay to water the world tree's roots, preserving its life and strength. Even the gods came to them for wisdom, though the price of knowledge was often more than the seeker bargained for. Mimisbranr, the well of wisdom, lay beneath another root. It was guarded by Mimir, wisest of all beings, whose knowledge encompassed all things that were, are, and might be. The price of a drink from his well was steep. Odin himself would one day give his eye for a single sip, but the knowledge gained was beyond measure. The 3rd well, Hvergelmir, was the source of all rivers, the spring from which the 11 Olivigar flowed. Here lived Nhggr and countless other serpents who fed on the dead and plotted the destruction of all things. It was a place of both creation and corruption, where life and death mingled in ways that defied understanding. The 9 realms hung from Yggdrasil's branches like fruit, each a world unto itself. Asgard, highest and most glorious, was the realm of the Aesir, connected to Midgard by the rainbow bridge Bifrost. Here stood great halls where the gods feasted and planned, where heroes came after death, where the fate of all worlds was debated and decided. Midgard, the middle realm, was the world of humans, surrounded by a great ocean in which the Midgard serpent lay coiled, so vast that he encircled the entire world and grasped his own tail in his mouth. When he stirred, earthquakes shook the land, and when he thrashed, tsunamis washed across distant shores. Jotunheim was the realm of the giants, a wild land of mountains and storms where ancient powers dwelt in halls of ice and stone. Not all giants were enemies of the gods, but they represented the old chaos, the primal forces that existed before order was imposed upon the world. Alfheim shone with eternal light, home to the light elves who were fair beyond description. Vanaheim was the realm of the Vanir, the other family of gods, with whom the Aesir had once warred and later made peace. Nidavellir, deep underground, was the realm of the dwarves, master craftsmen who forged wonders for gods and men alike. Svartalfheim housed the dark elves, beings of shadow and cunning who worked their own strange purposes. Muspelheim remained the realm of fire, guarded by Surtur and his burning legions. And deepest of all lay Helheim, the realm of the dead, ruled by Hel, daughter of Loki, where all who did not die in battle came to spend eternity in cold and shadow. This was the cosmos the three brothers made from Ymir's corpse, a universe balanced between order and chaos, light and darkness, creation and destruction. But it was not complete. The world needed guardians, rulers, beings who could stand against the forces of entropy and preserve what had been built. The brothers themselves took on this task, but they would need allies, companions, others who shared their vision of order and purpose. So began the Age of the Gods, when mighty beings walked between the worlds, when magic flowed like water, and when the fate of all existence hung balanced on the edge of a sword. The Aesir would rise to rule from Asgard, but their reign would not go unchallenged, and in the end, even gods must face their doom. For this was a cosmos born from violence, and violence would be its ultimate destiny. But first, there would be glory. There would be heroes and monsters, love and betrayal, wisdom and folly. There would be the greatest stories ever told, stories that would echo through the halls of time long after their speakers had fallen silent. The world was young, and anything seemed possible. In the early days after the world's creation, when the ash tree was still growing and the realms were settling into their appointed places, the gods began to take shape as a people, a family bound by blood and oath, love and rivalry. The Aesir, as they came to be called, built their halls in Asgard and established themselves as rulers of the cosmos. But they were not the only divine family in the 9 realms. In Vanaheim dwelt the Vanir, gods of fertility, prosperity, and wisdom, where the Aesir embodied war, order, and heroic struggle. The Vanir represented the abundant earth, the turning seasons, the quiet power that made crops grow and herds multiply. Their magic was older, deeper, more connected to the natural world. They saw the future in dreams, spoke with the spirits of land and water, and knew secrets the Aesir had never learned. Ngr was their sea king, lord of wind and wave, who could calm storms with a word and call fish to any net. His children were Freyr and Freyja, twins whose beauty was matched only by their power. Freyr ruled over peace and prosperity, sunshine and rain, the sacred boar and the ship that could sail through air as well as water. His very presence brought abundance, and no land remained barren where he was honored. Freyja was the Cedar Queen, mistress of magic and prophecy, love and war. She wore a necklace of gold and amber, rode in a chariot drawn by cats, and chose half the battle dead for her own hall, Sesrumner. Her tears were gold, her fury was lightning, and her wisdom ran deeper than the roots of the world tree. For a time, the 2 families of gods dwelt apart, each in their own realm, following their own ways. But as the world grew more complex and the threats to order multiplied, conflict became inevitable. The war that followed was the First Great War, a struggle that shook all 9 realms and nearly destroyed both divine families. It began, as many wars do, with an insult and broken trust. Some say a Vanir which named Gullveig came to Asgard and filled the Aesir with greed for gold. When they could not satisfy their craving, they burned her 3 times, and 3 times she was reborn from the flames. Others claim the conflict arose from rivalry over worship, over which family of gods should receive the prayers and sacrifices of mortal men. Whatever the cause, the war was devastating. The Aesir, led by Odin, were masters of battle fury and tactical cunning. The Vanir wielded cedar, magic that could turn an enemy's weapons against himself, that could send madness or visions, that could twist fate itself. Spears flew between the worlds, and the very foundations of Yggdrasil trembled. In the end, neither side could claim victory. Too much blood had been spilled, too much wisdom lost. A truce was called, and to seal it, the gods exchanged hostages. The Vanir sent their greatest treasures to Asgard, Njrr and his children Freyr and Freyja. The Aesir sent Honir, Odin's brother, and Mimir, the wise giant, to dwell among the Vanir. But the exchange did not go as planned. Honir was handsome and seemed wise in counsel, but only when Mimir whispered advice in his ear. When the Vanir discovered this deception, they beheaded Mimir and sent his head back to Odin. The All-Father, rather than taking offense, preserved the head with herbs and magic, and ever after consulted it for wisdom in times of great need. The integration of the Vanir into Asgard brought new power and knowledge to the Aesir. Freyja taught Odin the art of cedar, magic that had been forbidden to males in her people. Njrr's mastery of sea and storm proved invaluable in the gods' struggles against the giants. Freyr's gifts of prosperity made Asgard a place of abundance as well as war. Yet the joining of the two divine families also brought new tensions, new possibilities for both alliance and conflict. Njrr took a wife from among the giants, Skathi, daughter of the giant Jotzi. Their marriage was arranged as part of a peace settlement, but it was troubled from the start. She was a mountain dweller, a huntress who loved the howling winds and snow-covered peaks. He was a sea lord who needed the sound of waves and the cry of gulls. For 9 nights they dwelt in his hall by the sea, but she could not bear the sound of the waves or the smell of salt and fish. For 9 nights they lived in her mountain hall, but he could not endure the howling of wolves or the cold that bit through even divine flesh. In the end, they parted, she to her mountains and he to his sea, meeting only occasionally and always with the knowledge that their natures were too different for lasting happiness. Their marriage became a symbol of the necessary but uneasy alliance between different kinds of power, different ways of understanding the world. Other unions were more successful. Thor, mightiest of the Aesir, took Sif as his wife, she of the golden hair that rippled like wheat in summer wind. Their marriage was one of complementary strength, the thunder god's power wed to the earth's abundance. When Loki, in a moment of mischief, cut off Sif's hair while she slept, Thor's rage shook the heavens, and only the trickster's desperate journey to the dark elves, who spun new hair from pure gold, restored peace to the divine household. Baldr, most beloved of all the gods, married Nanna, and their love was so pure that it made even the stones weep with joy. Odin took many wives, both divine and mortal, for his hunger for knowledge and power was matched only by his need to father heroes who might aid in the final battle that was to come. But not all relationships among the gods were bound by blood or marriage vows. Loki, the trickster, the shape-changer, the one who stood both within the divine family and forever outside it, formed bonds that defied easy categorization. Son of the giant Laufey but foster brother to Odin, Loki was fire made flesh, clever and beautiful and utterly unpredictable. His jokes brought laughter to the halls of Asgard, but his pranks sometimes carried a cruel edge that hinted at darker things to come. He was a master of transformation, taking the shapes of animals, women, even inanimate objects when it suited his purposes. As a mare, he bore the 8-legged horse Sleipnir, Odin's mighty steed. As a fly, he tormented the dwarf smiths until they created the greatest treasures the gods possessed. As a salmon, he tried to escape justice when his tricks finally went too far. The gods valued Loki for his cleverness, for his ability to slip into enemy halls and learn their secrets, for his talent at talking his way out of seemingly impossible situations. But they also feared him, for he was fundamentally chaotic, a force of change in a cosmos that the gods were trying to preserve against entropy and destruction. He was necessary to them, but he was never truly one of them, and in the end, that difference would prove catastrophic for all. As the divine families merged and multiplied, Asgard became a place of wonders. 12 great halls housed the principal gods, each reflecting their owner's nature and purpose. Gladsheim, Odin's hall, had a roof of gold and silver and 540 doors, through each of which 800 warriors could march abreast. Vingolf was where the goddesses held their councils, a place of such beauty that mortal words could not describe it. Reimr was Thor's realm, where thunder echoed constantly and lightning played around the eaves. The gods did not merely feast and fight and plot in their halls. They were active forces in the world, shaping events, teaching mortals, battling the forces of chaos that constantly threatened to break down the order they had imposed. They were gardeners of reality, and their garden required constant tending. Yet even as they established their rule, the gods knew it would not last forever. The Norns had spoken the fate of all things, and that fate included the twilight of the gods themselves. Ragnarok, the doom of the powers, would come in its appointed time, and all their glory would pass away. But that knowledge did not make them despair. Instead, it spurred them to greater deeds, to create beauty and meaning in the time they had, to face the inevitable end with courage and defiance. This was the Age of Wonders, when the gods walked openly in the world, when magic flowed like water, when heroes could speak with ravens and wolves, when the very stones held wisdom for those who knew how to ask. It would not last, but while it did, it burned with a light that would never be completely extinguished, no matter how dark the world became. The stories of that age were many, and each carried within it a truth about the nature of gods and men, about the price of power and the burden of wisdom, about love and loss and the courage required to face an uncertain future. They were tales that would echo through all the worlds and all the ages, keeping alive the memory of a time when anything seemed possible and gods walked among mortals as both friends and teachers, protectors and destroyers, the shapers of destiny itself. Among all the gods of Asgard, none was more complex, more feared, or more essential than Odin All-Father, the one-eyed seeker of wisdom who traded everything, even pieces of himself, for knowledge of what was to come. He was king of the Aesir not through inherited right but through sacrifice and cunning, through his willingness to pay prices that others would not dare consider. Odin had many names, and each revealed a different aspect of his nature. He was the Raven God, for Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, flew forth each day to survey all the 9 realms and returned each evening to whisper in his ears all they had seen. He was the Gallows Lord, for he had hanged himself from Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights, pierced by his own spear, a sacrifice of himself to gain knowledge of the runes. He was the Wanderer, for he often walked the roads of Midgard disguised as an old man in a wide-brimmed hat, testing the hospitality and wisdom of mortals. The wisdom Odin sought was not mere learning but prophetic knowledge, understanding of the pattern that governed all things, sight of the future that rushed toward all the worlds like a flood. He knew that Ragnarok was coming, knew that the gods would fall and the 9 realms would burn, and this knowledge drove him to desperate measures. If the end could not be prevented, then perhaps it could be faced with honor, perhaps something might survive the conflagration. His quest for wisdom led him to the Well of Mimir, where the giant guardian demanded a terrible price for even a single drink. Odin did not hesitate. He plucked out his own eye and cast it into the well, trading physical sight for the inner sight of prophecy. Ever after, he saw with one eye the world as it was, and with the empty socket perceived the world as it would become. He learned the runes, the mystical symbols that held power over fate itself, by hanging from the world tree until he was nearly dead. For 9 days and nights he hung there, neither eating nor drinking, pierced by Gungnir, his great spear that never missed its target. The torture revealed to him the secrets of the cosmic alphabet, the letters with which the laws of reality were written. With this knowledge, he could bind oaths that could not be broken, speak words that could heal or kill, write symbols that could open any lock or break any chain. But perhaps most significantly for the fate of all the worlds, Odin learned Cedar, the magic of the Vanir, from Freyja herself. This was magic traditionally practiced by women, concerned with prophecy, shape-changing, and the manipulation of fate itself. For a male god to learn such arts was scandalous among the Aesir, but Odin cared nothing for convention. He needed every advantage he could gain in the struggle that was coming. Odin's hunger for wisdom extended to his treatment of the dead. While Freyja claimed half the battle slain for her hall, Odin gathered the other half in Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain. But these were not merely honored dead. They were his army, the Einherjar, who spent their days fighting in the courtyard of Valhalla and their evenings feasting on mead and the meat of the boar Saramnir, who was slaughtered each day and reborn each evening. The Valkyries, Odin's battle maidens, rode forth from Asgard to choose which warriors would die in battle and which would live to fight another day. They were not merely servants but extensions of Odin's will, his agents in the shaping of fate. Their leader was Brynhild, wisest and most beautiful of the Valkyries, until her disobedience led to her punishment and her tragic entanglement with mortal heroes. 8-legged Sleipnir carried Odin between the worlds faster than thought or wind. This gray stallion, offspring of Loki's shape-changed union with a giant's horse, could gallop across the Rainbow Bridge, through the air, and even down into the realm of the dead. On Sleipnir's back, Odin could reach any of the 9 realms in moments, appearing wherever wisdom might be gained or wherever his intervention might tip the balance in favor of order over chaos. Yet for all his power and wisdom, Odin was not a comfortable god to worship. He was the god of kings and jarls, of warriors and poets, but also of oath-breakers and deceivers when necessity demanded. He might appear to a hero in his hour of greatest need, offering victory and glory, but that same hero might later find himself abandoned when Odin's larger purposes required his death. The All-Father's loyalty was to the preservation of the cosmos itself, not to any individual, no matter how brave or beloved. This ruthless pragmatism was evident in his relationship with his own family. He loved his sons, but he knew that some of them were doomed, and he did not allow sentiment to interfere with necessity. When the prophecy spoke of Baldr's death, Odin sought to prevent it, but when prevention failed, He rode to Helheim itself to learn what the consequences would be. His relationship with Loki was perhaps the most complex of all. The trickster was his foster brother, bound to him by oaths sworn in the early days of the world, when both were younger and the future seemed more malleable. Odin valued Loki's cleverness, his ability to find solutions to problems that brute force could not address. But he also saw in the trickster the seeds of destruction, the chaos that would ultimately bring down the ordered world the gods had built. The tension between these two aspects of Odin's nature, the wise king and the desperate seeker, the protector of order and the willing partner of chaos, defined much of Norse mythology. He was a god who would do anything, sacrifice anyone, betray any trust if he believed it served the greater good of preserving the world. Yet his very actions often brought about the disasters he sought to prevent. In Midgard, Odin walked disguised among mortals, testing them, teaching them, sometimes helping and sometimes hindering according to purposes they could not fathom. He appeared to heroes at crossroads, offering them choices between long life and lasting fame, between safety and glory, between the easy path and the right one. His gifts came with prices, his blessings with curses, for he was not a god of comfort but of challenge. To those who proved worthy, he gave the greatest gifts: insight into their own nature, strength to face impossible odds, the knowledge that their deeds would echo through all the ages to come. To those who failed his tests, he gave harder lessons: the understanding that cowardice brought not safety but shame, that betrayal of oaths brought not advantage but destruction, that wisdom earned through suffering was the only wisdom worth having. Above all, Odin was the god of sacrifice, and the sacrifices he demanded were always meaningful, always costly, always transformative. He had given his eye for wisdom, his comfort for knowledge, his peace for power. He asked no less of those who would follow him. But for those willing to pay the price, he offered something precious: the chance to matter, to make a difference, to face the end of all things with courage and dignity intact. In the great hall of Valhalla, where the Einherjar trained each day for the final battle, Odin sat on his high throne Hlidskjalf, from which he could see all the 9 realms. His ravens perched on his shoulders, his wolves lay at his feet, and before him stretched the future he had paid so dearly to perceive. It was a dark future, filled with betrayal and loss, ending in fire and flood. But it was also a future in which heroes would rise, in which beauty would be created, in which the struggle against entropy would give meaning to existence itself. This was Odin's gift to the world. Not happiness, not peace, but purpose. In a cosmos that would ultimately end in destruction, he offered the chance to live lives worth remembering, to create stories worth telling, to face doom with such courage that even the act of losing became a kind of victory. He was a god of endings, but also of the defiance that made endings meaningful. While Odin sought wisdom in shadows and sacrifice, his son Thor walked the road of straightforward heroism, beloved by gods and mortals alike for his strength, his courage, and his unwavering dedication to protecting Midgard from the giants who constantly threatened to overwhelm it. If Odin was the brain of the Aesir, Thor was their strong right arm, the god who stood between civilization and chaos with his hammer raised and his red beard bristling with righteous fury. Thor was everything a hero should be: mighty without being boastful, brave without being foolhardy, loyal without being blind. His strength was legendary even among gods. He could drain the ocean in 3 swallows, lift the Midgard serpent with his bare hands, crack mountains with his footsteps. But it was not mere physical power that made Thor great. It was his dedication to protection, his willingness to put himself in danger again and again for the sake of those who could not defend themselves. His weapon was Mjolnir, the Crusher, forged by the dwarf brothers Eitri and Brokkr in a contest of skill with Loki's trickery. The hammer never missed its target, never failed to return to Thor's hand when thrown, and struck with the force of lightning itself. When Thor hurled Mjolnir, thunder rolled across all 9 realms, and when it struck, mountains shook and giants fled in terror. The hammer was more than a weapon. It was a sacred object that blessed marriages, consecrated oaths, and sanctified new ventures. Thor's priest would touch the hammer to a bride's lap to ensure fertility, to a newborn's forehead to grant protection, to the prow of a ship to guarantee safe voyage. In a world where the forces of chaos constantly pressed against the boundaries of civilization, Mjolnir represented the divine power that held the line. Thor's chariot was drawn by 2 goats, Tangrasnir and Tangjoster, Teeth-bearer and Teeth-grinder, who could run across the sky faster than any earthly steed. When Thor was hungry on his journeys, he would slaughter and cook the goats, then resurrect them the next morning by blessing their bones with his hammer, provided no bone had been broken. When his human companion Gylfi accidentally cracked a leg bone while gnawing out the marrow, the resurrected goat was left permanently lame, and Gylfi bound himself to Thor's service in recompense. The thunder god's appetite was as legendary as his strength. At the hall of the giant Tgarloki, Thor attempted to out-eat the giant's champion, not knowing that his opponent was wildfire itself, which consumes all things. He tried to outdrink their champion, not realizing he was draining the ocean itself. He attempted to lift their cat, unaware that it was the Midgard serpent in disguise. Though he failed these contests, his efforts were so prodigious that they terrified even the giants who had arranged them. Thor's greatest enemy was Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent, Loki's monstrous child who encircled the world and grasped his own tail. The prophecies declared that these two would slay each other at Ragnarok, but their enmity began long before that final day. Once, Thor went fishing for the serpent using the head of the giant Hymir's largest ox as bait. When Jormungandr took the hook, the battle between god and monster was so fierce that it nearly broke the world. Thor hauled the serpent up from the ocean depths, his feet crashing through the bottom of the boat and striking the seafloor. Just as he raised Mjolnir to deliver the killing blow, the terrified Hymir cut the line, and the serpent sank back into the depths to await their final encounter. This was typical of Thor's battles: straightforward, violent, and decisive. While Odin schemed and plotted, Thor simply found the source of trouble and smashed it. When the giants stole his hammer, Thor disguised himself as Freyja and attended his own wedding to the giant king Arwaimar, sitting veiled and silent through the feast until Mjolnir was brought forth to bless the union. Then he threw off his disguise and slaughtered every giant in the hall, reclaiming his weapon in a storm of blood and lightning. When the master builder came to Asgard and offered to construct an impregnable wall around the realm of the gods in exchange for Freyja, the sun, and the moon, the Aesir agreed to the bargain, certain that he could never complete such a task in the agreed-upon time. But the builder's stallion, Svalfari, proved able to haul stones of impossible size, and as the deadline approached, it became clear that he would finish the wall and claim his terrible price. Loki, who had argued for accepting the bargain, transformed himself into a mare and lured away the stallion, leaving the builder unable to complete his work. When the giant revealed his true nature in his rage, Thor stepped forward without ceremony and crushed his skull with a single blow of Mjolnir. Yet Thor was not merely a weapon wielded by the other gods. He had his own sense of justice, his own code of honor that sometimes put him at odds with his father's more complex schemes. When Loki's pranks crossed the line from mischief into malice, it was often Thor who called him to account. When giants threatened not just Asgard but the innocent people of Midgard, Thor needed no command from Odin to spring into action. His marriage to Sif was a love match that endured through all trials. When Loki cut off her golden hair in a moment of spite, Thor's rage was so terrible that the trickster fled to the realm of the Dark Elves and commissioned them to spin new hair from pure gold, even more beautiful than what had been lost. The incident revealed both Thor's deep love for his wife and his willingness to use force to protect those he cared about. Thor's relationship with mortals was simpler and more direct than that of any other god. Where Odin tested and challenged, Thor protected and defended. Where Freyja demanded complex rituals and offerings, Thor was satisfied with simple acknowledgement of his strength. Farmers called on him for protection against wolves and storms. Warriors invoked his name before battle, knowing that he understood the straightforward courage required to face one's enemies with honor. In the halls of Asgard, Thor was the voice of action when others counseled delay, the advocate for direct solutions when others preferred subtle schemes. He was not stupid. No god could be truly stupid and survive in the complex politics of the divine realm, but he was uncomplicated in his motivations. He wanted to protect the innocent, punish the guilty, and preserve the order that allowed civilization to flourish. This clarity of purpose made Thor both beloved and sometimes frustrating to his fellow gods. They valued his strength and loyalty, but they also knew that his direct approach could sometimes create more problems than it solved. A giant who might have been negotiated with or tricked into serving the god's purposes was of no use once Thor had split his skull with Mjolnir. Yet as the signs of Ragnarok multiplied and the threats to the 9 realms grew ever more severe, the gods found themselves increasingly grateful for Thor's straightforward heroism. Complex schemes and subtle manipulations had their place, but when the wolves were literally at the door, there was no substitute for a god who would plant his feet, raise his hammer, and stand ready to face whatever came, no matter how terrible or overwhelming. In the songs that mortals sang around their fires, in the prayers they whispered in times of danger, in the stories they told their children about what it meant to be brave, Thor's name echoed again and again. He was the god who proved that sometimes, in a world full of tricksters and schemers, monsters and madmen, what was needed most was someone willing to stand up and fight for what was right, no matter the cost. The thunder that rolled across the sky was Thor's voice, promising that as long as he drew breath, the innocent would not stand undefended. The lightning that split the darkness was the gleam of Mjolnir, reminding all who saw it that some things were worth fighting for, no matter how dark the world became. Among all the gods of Asgard, none was more beloved than Baldr the Beautiful, Odin's son whose very presence brought light to the darkest corners of the world. His skin was white as snow, his hair bright as spun gold, and when he spoke, his voice was like the sound of silver bells carried on a summer breeze. Flowers bloomed where he walked, children laughed when he smiled, and even the stones seemed to shine more brightly in his presence. Baldr was more than beautiful. He was goodness itself made manifest. He was just without being harsh, gentle without being weak, wise without being cruel. In him, the gods saw what they might become if they could transcend their own natures, if they could rise above the petty jealousies and violent passions that so often drove their actions. He was their hope made flesh, their promise that the world they had built contained the possibility of redemption. His hall in Asgard was called Breidablik, the broad gleaming, and nothing unclean could enter there. No lie could be spoken within its walls. No violence could be contemplated beneath its roof. It was a place of pure peace, where the other gods came when they needed respite from the constant struggle against chaos, where they could remember why they fought and what they fought to preserve. Baldr was married to Nanna, daughter of Nep, and their love was so pure and strong that it became a byword for faithfulness throughout all the 9 realms. When Baldr smiled at his wife, the very air around them shimmered with joy. When they walked together through the meadows of Asgard, even the ravens forgot their harsh cries and sang sweetly from the branches above. But such perfection could not last in a world where the forces of destruction were always pressing at the boundaries of order. The dreams began to come to Baldr in the depth of winter, dark visions of his own death, shadows that reached for him with grasping fingers, flames that consumed all beauty and left only ash behind. Each morning he woke trembling, and each night the dreams grew stronger, more vivid, more certain. When Baldr told the other gods of his nightmares, a chill settled over Asgard that had nothing to do with the season. If Baldr could die, if goodness itself could be extinguished, what hope was there for any of them? Frigg, his mother, took action immediately. She traveled to all the 9 realms and extracted oaths from everything that existed. Fire and water, iron and stone, trees and beasts, birds and serpents, sickness and poison, that none would harm her beloved son. Everything swore the oath willingly, for all things loved Baldr. Only one small thing did Frigg overlook: a sprig of mistletoe growing west of Valhalla, so young and harmless that it seemed beneath notice. This oversight would prove fatal, for in the cosmic order that governed the Norse universe, even the smallest gap in protection could become a gateway for destruction. When Frigg returned to Asgard and announced that Baldr was now invulnerable to all harm, the gods celebrated with games. They would throw spears at Baldr and watch them turn aside, strike him with swords that became as gentle as feathers, shoot arrows that fell harmlessly at his feet. It became their favorite entertainment, seeing their beloved companions stand untouched in the center of a storm of weapons, laughing at the impossibility of harming perfect goodness. But Loki watched these games with growing resentment. Perhaps he was jealous of the love that flowed so freely toward Baldr when his own clever gifts earned him only wary tolerance. Perhaps he saw in Baldr's perfection a reproach to his own chaotic nature. Or perhaps he simply could not bear the sight of something so purely good in a world he knew was doomed to end in fire and darkness. Whatever his motivation, Loki transformed himself into an old woman and approached Frigg with seemingly innocent questions about her son's protection. When the goddess, proud of her work, mentioned the single thing that had not sworn the oath, the little mistletoe west of Valhalla, Loki knew he had found his weapon. He went to the place Frigg had described and found the mistletoe, young and green and utterly harmless. But in Loki's hands, harmlessness became the deadliest force of all. He fashioned the plant into a dart, sharp and true, and returned to where the gods played their games around Baldr. Baldr's blind brother, stood apart from the others, unable to join in their sport because he could not see to aim. Loki approached him with false sympathy, offering to guide his hand so that he too could honor Baldr by showing his invulnerability. Grateful for the chance to participate, accepted the trickster's help. Loki placed the mistletoe dart in HR's hand and guided his aim. When the blind god threw, the dart flew straight and true, piercing Baldr's heart. The most beloved of the gods fell dead without a word, and with his death, the light seemed to go out of the world. The silence that followed was deeper than the silence of death. It was the silence of hope dying, of faith cracking, of the recognition that if Baldr could be killed, then nothing good was safe in all the 9 realms. When the gods finally found their voices, their mourning shook the branches of Yggdrasil and set the dead stirring in their graves. Frigg's grief was beyond measure, but she did not give in to despair. She asked if any among the gods would ride to Hel's realm and attempt to ransom Baldr back from death. Hermr, another of Odin's sons, volunteered for the perilous journey. He mounted Sleipnir and rode hard for 9 days and nights, crossing the Rainbow Bridge, passing through dark valleys where no light shone, until he reached the gates of Helheim. The goddess Hel, half living and half corpse, daughter of Loki and ruler of the dead, received Hermr in her hall. Baldr sat at her high table, but he was pale and silent, already marked by the realm of the dead. Hermr pleaded for his brother's release, offering whatever price Hel might demand. Hel's answer was cunning in its simplicity. If all things in the 9 realms would weep for Baldr, she would release him. If even one thing refused to shed tears, he would remain in her hall forever. It seemed a reasonable request. Surely all creation would mourn the death of goodness itself. Hermr returned to Asgard with this message, and the gods immediately sent messengers throughout all the realms. Everything wept for Baldr. Men and women, beasts and birds, trees and stones, metals and earth. The very air itself seemed to weep, as rain fell from cloudless skies and dew gathered on every surface. But in a cave at the edge of the world, the messengers found an ancient giantess named KK who refused to weep. "Let Hel hold what she has," the crone declared. "Baldr never brought me joy in life, and I'll shed no tears for him in death." Only later did the gods realize that KK was Loki in disguise, ensuring that his crime would be permanent and irreversible. Because one being had refused to weep, Baldr remained in Helheim, and with him went much of the hope and joy of Asgard. His death marked the beginning of the end, the first sign that Ragnarok was drawing near. The gods' rage against Loki was terrible, but their sorrow was greater still. They had learned that their power had limits, that their love could not protect what they most cherished, that even gods could lose what mattered most to them. Nanna, Baldr's wife, died of grief at his funeral pyre, choosing to join him in death since she could not have him in life. Odin placed his golden armring Draupnir on the pyre as well, a gift that would return 8-fold every 9th night, ensuring that Baldr would have wealth in the halls of the dead. The ship Ringhorn, greatest of all vessels, carried the pyre out to sea, where the flames that consumed god and goddess lit the sky with beauty and sorrow. The death of Baldr changed everything in the world of the gods. Where once there had been certainty that good would ultimately triumph, now there was only the knowledge that even the best and purest could fall. Where once the gods had seemed invincible in their glory, now they appeared fragile, vulnerable to forces they could not completely control. Loki's punishment was swift and terrible. The gods captured him and bound him in a cave with the entrails of his own son Narfi, while above his head a serpent dripped burning venom onto his face. His wife Sigyn sat beside him with a bowl, catching the poison, but when she turned away to empty the bowl, the venom fell on Loki's face and his agony shook the entire world with earthquakes. But even bound and tormented, Loki remained dangerous. His hatred of the gods, fed by centuries of slights and suspicions, grew stronger with each drop of venom that burned his flesh. He would remain imprisoned until Ragnarok, when the bonds would break and he would lead the forces of destruction against the very gods who had once called him brother. Baldr's death was more than the loss of a single god, no matter how beloved. It was the breaking of the cosmic order, the proof that the world the gods had built was not eternal, that beauty and goodness were not invincible, that even divine love could not prevent the triumph of death. From that day forward, the gods knew that their time was ending, that the twilight was beginning, that everything they had fought to preserve would ultimately be consumed by fire and darkness. Yet Baldr's death was also a promise. The prophecy spoke of a time beyond Ragnarok, when the world would be reborn and Baldr would return from the dead to rule over a realm where no shadow could ever fall. His sacrifice, unwilling though it was, would become the seed from which a new and better world would grow. But that world lay beyond the death of gods and the burning of the world tree, beyond sorrow and loss and the final battle that would determine the fate of all existence. For now, there was only grief, and the growing certainty that the end of all things was rushing toward them like a winter storm that would leave no corner of creation untouched. The binding of Loki marked the beginning of the end times, but the gods' struggles were far from over. The 9 realms seethed with unrest as the balance that had maintained order began to break down. In Midgard, heroes rose and fell in an endless cycle of glory and tragedy, their deeds echoing the cosmic drama being played out in the halls of gods and giants. Greatest among these heroes was Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, whose saga would be told around fires until the end of the world. His story began with a curse, as so many Norse tales did, and it would end with a curse as well, but between beginning and ending lay deeds that made him the equal of gods in fame if not in power. Sigurd was descended from the Volsung clan, a lineage that traced its origins to Odin himself. His great-grandfather was Sigi, a son of the All-Father who had been exiled for murder and who founded a dynasty of kings in the southern lands. Sigi's son was Rerir, and Rerir's son was Volsung, who built a great hall around a mighty oak tree, its branches forming the roof and its trunk standing in the center of the feasting space. The oak was sacred to Odin, and when Volsung's daughter Signy was wed against her will to Siggeir, a king whose nature was evil beneath his fair exterior, the All-Father appeared at the wedding feast. Disguised as an old one-eyed wanderer, he drove a magnificent sword deep into the trunk of the oak, declaring that whoever could draw it forth would own the finest blade ever forged. Many tried to claim the sword, including Siggeir himself, but the blade remained fast in the wood until Sigmund, Volsung's son, grasped the hilt. The sword came free in his hand as easily as if it had been resting in a scabbard, and from that moment, Sigmund was marked by destiny. Sigurd's jealousy was immediate and consuming. He invited the Volsungs to visit his realm, then betrayed them, killing old Volsung and capturing his sons. One by one, the brothers were taken to a forest and left bound for wolves to devour, until only Sigmund remained alive, saved by Signy's secret aid and his own fierce will to survive. For years, Sigmund lived as an outlaw in the wilderness, nursing his hatred and waiting for his chance at vengeance. Signy, trapped in marriage to her father's killer, bore children to Sigurd, but their hearts were too soft for the harsh deed required. Finally, she disguised herself and lay with her own brother, conceiving a son whose nature would be purely Volsung, untainted by Sigurd's corrupted blood. This son was Sinfjotli, raised by Sigmund in the wild places, trained from childhood in the arts of war and vengeance. Together, father and son took the shapes of wolves, donning cursed pelts that gave them beast form but also beast fury that was almost impossible to control. When Sinfjotli attacked Sigmund in wolf shape, nearly killing him, they cast off the pelts and never wore them again. At last, the day of reckoning came. Sigmund and Sinfjotli returned to Sigurd's hall during a great feast, hiding themselves in the cellar among the ale casks. When they were discovered, Sigurd ordered them buried alive, but Signy managed to throw Sigmund's sword into the burial mound. With the blade that Odin had given him, Sigmund cut his way free and set fire to the hall above. As the flames consumed the building and everyone within it, Signy appeared at the doorway. She confessed her deception, revealed that Sinfjotli was born of incest as well as vengeance, then walked back into the fire to die with the husband she had helped destroy. Her sacrifice was complete. She had preserved her family's honor and destroyed their enemies, but the price had been her own soul. Sigmund returned to his ancestral lands and ruled long and well, taking new wives and fathering other children. But the sword that had won him his throne also sealed his fate. In his final battle, he faced an enemy in whom he recognized the familiar figure of Odin, come to reclaim the blade he had given. When Sigmund struck at his opponent, the sword shattered against the god's spear, and Sigmund fell mortally wounded. Before he died, Sigmund commanded his pregnant wife Hjordis to save the broken pieces of the sword, for their unborn son would reforge it and win greater glory than any Volsung before him. That son was Sigurd, raised by the dwarf king Regan, who had his own reasons for shaping the boy into a hero. Regan was brother to Ottar and Fafnir, sons of the dwarf Hreidmar, who had once been paid Wergild in the form of a cursed golden hoard. Ottar had been killed accidentally by Loki, who was traveling with Odin and Honir, when the god struck down what he thought was merely an otter fishing in a stream. When Hreidmar demanded compensation, Loki was forced to obtain the gold hoard of the dwarf Andvari, including a ring that the dwarf cursed with his dying breath. The curse worked swiftly. Fafnir murdered his father for the gold, then transformed himself into a great dragon to guard the hoard, breathing poison and fire, growing ever more monstrous as the years passed. Regan, cheated of his share of the inheritance, nursed his resentment and waited for his chance at revenge. That chance came in the form of Sigurd. Regan fostered the boy, teaching him the arts of smithcraft and war, filling his head with tales of the great dragon and the treasure it guarded. When Sigurd came of age, Regan helped him reforge his father's broken sword, creating a blade so sharp it could cut an anvil in two. so strong it could cleave through any armor ever made. The sword was called Gram, the Wrath, and with it Sigurd rode forth to face Fafnir. But he did not ride blindly into battle. At Odin's advice, he dug a pit in the path the dragon used to reach its watering hole, hiding there until the great worm passed overhead. When Fafnir's soft belly was directly above him, Sigurd drove Gram upward with all his strength, piercing the dragon's heart. As Fafnir lay dying, he warned Sigurd that the gold was cursed, that it would bring death to all who possessed it. But the hero was young and bold, and he thought himself strong enough to bear any curse. When Regan arrived and asked Sigurd to roast Fafnir's heart for him to eat, claiming that consuming it would grant wisdom, Sigurd agreed. But as he turned the heart over the fire, fat spattered from it and burned his finger. When he put the finger in his mouth to ease the pain, he tasted the dragon's blood and suddenly understood the speech of birds. The ravens perched nearby were discussing Regan's treachery, how the dwarf planned to kill Sigurd once the dragon's heart had been consumed, claiming both wisdom and gold for himself. Without hesitation, Sigurd drew Gram and beheaded Regan, then ate the dragon's heart himself, gaining not only the ability to understand all tongues, but also prophetic wisdom that would serve him in the trials to come. He loaded the cursed gold onto his horse Grani, Sleipnir's son, and rode forth into a wider world, not knowing that he carried with him the seeds of his own destruction. The hoard would indeed prove cursed, bringing death and betrayal to all who touched it, just as Fafnir had prophesied. Sigurd's own end would come through treachery and broken oaths, his glory dimmed by the very treasure he had won. But his name would outlive kingdoms, his deeds would inspire heroes yet unborn, and his sword would pass into legend as the weapon of the greatest hero the North ever knew. Such was the nature of heroism in the world of the Norse. Glorious and doomed, shining brightly but briefly, leaving behind only memory and the echo of great deeds. The heroes were mortal, but their stories were eternal, and in the end, perhaps that was glory enough. After slaying Fafnir and claiming the cursed hoard, Sigurd rode deeper into the wilderness, following roads that seemed to lead beyond the edge of the known world. His journey brought him to a mountain surrounded by a wall of fire that burned without fuel, its flames reaching toward the sky like grasping fingers. No ordinary man could pass through such a barrier, but Sigurd was no ordinary man, and Grani was no ordinary horse. They leaped through the flames as if they were morning mist, and on the far side of the fire, Sigurd found a hall of glass and gold, and within it a figure in armor lying as still as death. When he removed the helmet, he discovered that the warrior was a woman of extraordinary beauty, her face peaceful in enchanted sleep. This was Brynhild, once the greatest of Odin's Valkyries, now bound by the Allfather's curse to sleep until a hero brave enough to cross the fire should wake her. Brynhild had been punished for disobedience. In a battle between two kings, Odin had decreed that the elder should win, but Brynhild's sense of justice compelled her to give victory to the younger, who fought for a more righteous cause. For this defiance, Odin had stripped her of her divine nature and condemned her to mortal life, decreeing that she would marry the first man who could breach her fiery prison. When Sigurd's sword cut through the enchanted mail that bound her and she woke to find him leaning over her, Brynhild knew that she had found not just her rescuer but her fate. They pledged their love on that mountaintop, exchanging rings and swearing oaths that should have bound them together until the end of the world. Sigurd gave her Andvari's ring, the cursed gold band that carried with it the promise of destruction, and she accepted it gladly, seeing only the love it represented. But their happiness was brief. Sigurd's path led him away from the mountain, down into the realm of men where kings ruled and heroes were welcome at any hearth. He came at last to the hall of Juki, where he was received with honor and made one of the family. Juki's wife, Grimhild, was skilled in magic, and she saw in Sigurd a means to advance her children's fortunes. She brewed a potion of forgetfulness and gave it to Sigurd at a great feast, and when he drank, all memory of Brynhild faded from his mind like morning frost touched by sunlight. In his confusion, he accepted the love of Juki's daughter Gudrun, a maiden fair and gentle who deserved better than to be loved by a man whose heart truly belonged to another. Sigurd married Gudrun and became brother to her siblings, Gunnar, who would be king after his father, Hogni the Fierce, and Guthorm the youngest. Together they rode on many adventures, winning fame and treasure, and for a time it seemed that Sigurd had found a new destiny, one unmarked by the curse that followed Fafnir's gold. But the curse was patient, and Grimhild's magic could not hold forever. When Gunnar sought a wife worthy of his station, his mother directed his attention to the maiden who slept within a wall of fire, the most beautiful woman in the world, who would marry only the bravest of heroes. Gunnar attempted to cross the flames but could not, for his heart lacked the perfect courage that such a feat required. In his pride, he could not admit failure, so he asked Sigurd to take his shape through sorcery and win the maiden for him. Sigurd, his memory still clouded by Grimhild's potion, agreed to help his brother-in-law, not recognizing the name of Brynhild or understanding what he was about to destroy. In Gunnar's form, Sigurd again leaped through the flames and found Brynhild waiting, though she was puzzled by the change she sensed in her beloved. The hero she remembered had been bold and passionate. This one was formal and distant, claiming her as prize rather than embracing her as lover. But the figure before her wore Sigurd's face, and the ring on her finger was proof of their earlier love. So she consented to become Gunnar's bride, not understanding the deception being practiced upon her. The wedding feast was magnificent, attended by kings and jarls from across the known world. But when Brynhild saw the real Sigurd sitting beside Gudrun, her memory returned in a rush of anguish and rage. She understood then how she had been deceived, how her true love had been stolen from her through magic and lies, how she had been given to a lesser man while the hero she loved had forgotten her very existence. The curse of the ring began to work in earnest then, poisoning every relationship, turning love to hatred and loyalty to betrayal. Brynhild could not bear to see Sigurd happy with another woman when she was trapped in marriage to a man she did not love. She began to plot his destruction, using her knowledge of men's pride and weakness to turn Gunnar against his brother-in-law. The trigger came during a petty quarrel between the two queens about precedence at a river crossing. Gudrun, stung by Brynhild's haughty manner, revealed the truth about her husband's deception, showing her rival the ring that Sigurd had taken from her finger during their false wedding night. Brynhild realized then that even in Gunnar's shape, Sigurd had been true to his marriage vows with Gudrun, and this faithfulness to another woman hurt worse than any betrayal. Consumed by jealousy and despair, Brynhild demanded that Gunnar avenge the insult to her honor. When he hesitated, knowing that Sigurd was the greatest warrior alive and his own brother by marriage, she threatened to leave him and return to her father's house, bringing shame on all his lineage. Caught between love and honor, Gunnar chose the path that would destroy them all. The brothers could not kill Sigurd themselves, for they had sworn oaths of brotherhood that even death could not break. Instead, they persuaded their youngest brother Guthorm, who had sworn no such oaths, to do the deed. They fed him wolf's meat and serpent's flesh to make him fierce, and gave him a sword enchanted to pierce any armor, any flesh, no matter how strong. Guthorm crept into Sigurd's bedchamber while the hero slept and drove the sword deep into his back. But even dying, Sigurd was terrible. He grasped Gram and hurled it at his assassin with such force that it cut Guthorm in two, the blade lodging in the far wall of the chamber. The greatest hero of the age died as he had lived, with a weapon in his hand and defiance in his heart. Gudrun's grief was terrible to behold, but Brynhild's reaction was even more disturbing. She laughed when she heard of Sigurd's death, a sound like ice breaking on a winter river, but then began to weep and could not stop. She had achieved her revenge, but it tasted like ashes in her mouth. She had destroyed the only man she had ever loved because she could not bear to see him love another. At Sigurd's funeral, Brynhild could stand no more. She confessed her part in his death, revealed the truth about Gunnar's cowardice and Sigurd's nobility, then drove a sword through her own heart, choosing to die rather than live with the knowledge of what her jealousy had wrought. Her last request was to be burned on the same pyre as Sigurd, that they might be united in death as fate had prevented them from being united in life. The flames that consumed Sigurd and Brynhild lit the sky for 3 days and nights, visible from all the surrounding kingdoms. Kings and warriors came from far and wide to witness the burning, and when it was over, they all agreed that they had seen the end of the heroic age, the passing of the last great champion of the old ways. But the curse of the gold was not finished with the house of Juki. Gudrun, mad with grief, eventually remarried, but her second husband was Atli, king of the Huns, Brynhild's brother, who had heard tales of the treasure Sigurd had won from Fafnir's hoard. He invited Gunnar and Hogni to visit his court, promising rich gifts and high honor, but his true purpose was to claim the gold that he believed was rightfully his. The brothers knew it was a trap, but they went anyway, for their honor demanded it. Before leaving, they hid the treasure in the Rhine, swearing that neither would reveal its location as long as the other lived. Atli's tortures could not break their resolve. He cut out Hogni's heart while he still lived, but the hero only laughed at death. When Gunnar was thrown into a pit of serpents, he played his harp with his toes until the snakes fell asleep, dying only when a great viper bit him in the chest. Gudrun's revenge on Atli was swift and terrible. She killed their 2 sons and served their flesh to their father at a feast, then burned his hall with all his retainers inside. The last of the gold curse had been fulfilled, and the treasure of the dwarf Vari remained lost beneath the waters of the Rhine, waiting for another age and other heroes to discover its deadly beauty. Such was the saga of Sigurd Dragonslayer, mightiest of heroes, whose glory burned bright and brief like a flame in darkness. He had won treasure and fame, love and honor, but in the end, the curse proved stronger than his sword, and the gods' design for the world proved greater than any mortal's desire for happiness. Yet his story endured, passed down through generations of bards and storytellers, reminding all who heard it that even the mightiest heroes were subject to fate, that even the greatest love could be corrupted by pride and jealousy, that in a world where the gods themselves were doomed, no mortal joy could last forever. The death of heroes was a sign, a warning that the end times were approaching. In the halls of Asgard, the gods felt the changing of the age like a cold wind that penetrated even their divine flesh. The signs were everywhere for those who knew how to read them. The growing boldness of the giants, the restlessness of the dead, the dimming of the lights that had once burned so brightly in the world. Odin, ever watchful from his throne Hlidskjalf, saw the threads of fate drawing together toward their final pattern. The Voluspa, the prophecy of the seeress, had foretold this time. When brother would fight brother, when the bonds of kinship would break, when the sun would dim and the stars would fall from their places in the sky. Ragnarok was coming, the twilight of the gods, the final battle that would determine whether order or chaos would inherit the ruins of the world. The first sign was the Fimbulwinter, the mighty winter that would last for 3 full years without any summer between. Snow would fall constantly, covering the earth in white silence, and the cold would be so bitter that it would freeze the very air. Men would turn against each other in their desperation. Fathers killing sons for scraps of food, brothers betraying brothers for the promise of warmth. Odin had tried to prepare for this time, gathering the slain heroes in Valhalla, teaching them to fight as a unit, forging them into an army that might stand against the forces of destruction. The Einherjar trained each day in the courtyard of the Hall of the Slain, their weapons ringing against each other in endless practice for a battle that would come all too soon. But preparation could only go so far. The prophecies were clear about the outcome of Ragnarok. The gods would lose. The forces of chaos, led by Loki and his monstrous children, would overwhelm even the combined might of the Aesir and the greatest heroes of Midgard. The world tree would burn, the 9 realms would be consumed by fire and flood, and even the gods would fall. Yet still they prepared, because that was what gods did. They fought against impossible odds. They stood for order even when order was doomed. They preserved what could be preserved and faced the end with weapons in their hands. If they were to lose, they would lose gloriously, and something of their glory might survive the flames. The approach of Ragnarok was marked by signs and portents that grew more ominous with each passing season. In Midgard, men began to forget the old ways, to neglect the sacrifices and rituals that maintained the compact between mortals and gods. They turned to easier gods, gentler faiths that promised salvation without struggle, redemption without sacrifice. The giants grew bolder, venturing closer to the walls of Asgard, testing the defenses that had held them back since the beginning of the world. Ancient monsters stirred in their lairs, sensing that their time was coming. The Midgard serpent thrashed in the depths of the ocean, causing earthquakes and tidal waves. The wolf Fenrir, bound in Gleipnir since his youth, strained against his chains with ever-increasing fury. And deep beneath the earth, in the cave where he lay bound, Loki felt the approach of his liberation. The serpent's venom still dripped onto his face, and his wife Sigyn still caught what she could in her bowl. But with each earthquake that shook the world, the bonds that held him grew a little weaker. Soon, very soon, he would be free to lead the forces of destruction against the gods who had betrayed him. The final phase would begin when the great wolf skull finally caught and devoured the sun, plunging all the worlds into darkness. His brother Hati would swallow the moon, and the stars would fall like burning rain from the blackened sky. The sea would rise and cover the land, while from the east would come Loki's ship Naglfar, built from the fingernails of the dead, carrying an army of giants and monsters to the final battlefield. But that ending lay still in the future, visible to the gods but not yet inevitable. There was still time for a few more stories, a few more moments of glory before the darkness fell. The heroes of Midgard continued to fight their battles. The gods continued to defend their realm, and the world continued to turn beneath the branches of Yggdrasil. In these last days before the end, every deed carried extra weight. Every choice echoed with greater significance. The gods knew they were living in the twilight of their age, and that knowledge gave their actions a desperate intensity, a fierce beauty born of the certainty that everything they built would soon be torn down. Yet they built anyway and fought anyway and loved anyway because that was what it meant to be divine. Not to be immortal, not to be unchanging, but to create meaning in the face of meaninglessness, to preserve beauty in the face of destruction, to stand for order even when chaos was destined to triumph. The stories they lived in those final days would be the last great tales of the old world, the swan songs of gods and heroes who had chosen to face the end with courage rather than flee from it in fear. And when the flames finally came, when the world burned and the gods fell and the Age of Wonders ended forever, those stories would be all that remained of their glory. But perhaps, in the end, stories were the only immortality that truly mattered. As the signs of the ending times multiplied, the gods made their final preparations with the grim determination of warriors who knew their cause was lost but fought on nonetheless. In Valhalla, the Einherjar trained with desperate intensity, their practice battles growing more violent, more realistic, as if they could somehow change fate through the sheer force of their preparation. Thor spent his days hunting giants with renewed fury, his hammer striking down any who dared venture too close to the borders of Midgard. He knew that his destined opponent was Jormungandr, the world serpent, and that their mutual destruction was foretold. Yet he continued to defend the realm of men as if their battle might somehow end differently, as if courage and determination might triumph over prophecy. Odin's search for wisdom became more frantic, more desperate. He consulted every oracle, bargained with every seer, seeking some loophole in fate, some way to alter the course of events that rushed toward them like an avalanche. He learned new spells, gathered more warriors, forged new alliances, but always the prophecies remained unchanged. The gods would fall, the world would burn, and only ashes would remain. In the realm of the giants, different preparations were underway. The ancient enemies of the gods sensed the approaching end of the age and made ready to play their part in the final drama. Surtur, the fire giant who had guarded Muspelheim since the beginning of time, took down his flaming sword and began to sharpen it for the battle to come. The blade blazed with heat that could melt mountains, and when he swung it, the very air caught fire. The frost giants gathered their armies, warriors of ice and stone who had nursed their hatred of the gods for uncounted centuries. They remembered every slight, every defeat, every kinsman slain by Thor's hammer or Odin's spear. Their time for revenge was coming, and they meant to make the most of it. But it was Loki who would lead the forces of destruction when the final day arrived. Bound beneath the earth, tortured by the serpent's venom, he had years to plan his revenge against the gods who had once called him brother. His hatred was not the simple rage of the giants, but something far more complex and dangerous. The fury of one who had been loved and then rejected, who had been trusted and then betrayed. The breaking of Loki's bonds would be the signal for Ragnarok to begin in earnest. The earthquakes caused by his struggles had already begun to weaken the chains that held Fenrir, his monstrous son. When the great wolf finally broke free from Gleipnir, his first act would be to free his father, and together they would gather the armies of chaos for the final assault on Asgard. Fenrir had grown mighty during his captivity, fed on hatred and the memory of the gods' betrayal when they had pretended to play games with him while binding him with the unbreakable chain. His jaws could now swallow the moon, his claws could rend the very fabric of reality, and his howl could shake the roots of Yggdrasil. When he ran, the earth trembled beneath his paws, and when he breathed, winter came to whatever land felt his exhalation. His brother Jormungandr stirred in the depths of the ocean, his massive coils tightening around Midgard as he prepared to rise from the waves. The world serpent had grown so large that he encircled the entire realm of men, and when he moved, tidal waves crashed against distant shores. His venom was so potent that even the air around him became poisonous, killing birds that flew too close and withering trees that grew near the water's edge. Their sister Hel waited in her realm of the dead, gathering an army of those who had died of sickness, old age, or accident. All those who had not earned a place in Valhalla or Folkvangr through death in battle. Her forces were vast, for death claimed far more through disease and mishap than through sword and spear. The dishonored dead, the cowardly dead, the forgotten dead, all would rise at her command to march against the gods who had given them no glory in life. The approach of Ragnarok was marked not only by these cosmic preparations but by signs visible to mortal eyes. In Midgard, the social order began to break down as the bonds that held communities together weakened and snapped. Brother turned against brother, son against father, as the harsh conditions of the Fimbulwinter brought out the worst in human nature. The old laws were forgotten as men struggled simply to survive. Sacred oaths were broken without shame, guest right was violated, and the hospitality that had once been the foundation of civilized society crumbled into suspicion and violence. Warriors who had once fought for honor now fought only for food and shelter, and kings who had once protected their people became no better than bandits and raiders. Women abandoned their children when they could no longer feed them, and children abandoned their elderly parents when they became burdens too heavy to bear. The weak were left to die while the strong preyed upon each other with increasing savagery. It was as if the very concept of civilization was dissolving, leaving only the law of tooth and claw. In this chaos, new prophets arose, proclaiming different gods, gentler gods who promised salvation to all who would abandon the harsh ways of the Aesir. They spoke of a single deity who demanded no sacrifices of blood or gold, who offered forgiveness instead of demanding vengeance, who promised eternal life to those who would forsake the warrior's path. Many listened to these prophets, for their message was comforting in a world grown cold and cruel. But Odin knew that such comfort was an illusion. The gentle gods might offer peace, but they could not offer strength, and strength was what would be needed in the trials to come. Better to face the end with a weapon in hand than to meet it on one's knees, begging for mercy from powers that might not even exist. As the final winter deepened and the darkness grew longer with each passing day, strange phenomena began to manifest throughout the 9 realms. The northern lights, once beautiful curtains of green and gold that danced across the night sky, became violent storms of crimson that seemed to drip blood upon the snow. The aurora was the reflection of the Einherjar's practice battles in Valhalla, but now it looked less like the play of warriors and more like the aftermath of a slaughter. The dead began to walk in Midgard, not as the vengeful Draugr of old tales, but as lost souls seeking something they could not name. They wandered the roads at night, neither truly alive nor properly dead, moaning in languages that predated human speech. Dogs howled at their passing, and horses refused to travel paths where they had walked. Trees began to wither without cause, their leaves falling out of season, their bark splitting to reveal wood that looked diseased and corrupt. The very earth seemed sick, as if some poison were seeping up from the depths to contaminate everything it touched. Springs that had run clear for centuries suddenly flowed red as blood, and wells that had never run dry became empty holes that echoed with distant screams. Birds fell from the sky in great numbers, their bodies unmarked by any visible wound. Fish floated belly up in streams and lakes, their flesh too foul even for carrion eaters to consume. The natural order that had governed the world since its creation was breaking down, preparing for the cosmic conflagration that would sweep it all away. In Asgard, the gods felt these changes like physical wounds. They were bound to the world they had created, and as it sickened, so did they. Odin's remaining eye grew dim, and he found it harder to see across the 9 realms from his high seat. Thor's strength seemed less than it had been, though he told no one of his growing weariness. Even the light of Baldr's memory, which had sustained them through their darkest hours, began to fade as hope died in the hearts of gods and men alike. The rainbow bridge Bifrost, which had connected Asgard to the other realms since the beginning of time, began to show cracks and gaps. Sometimes travelers would find themselves falling through holes in its span, tumbling into the void between worlds, lost forever in the emptiness that surrounded creation. The very pathways that held the cosmos together were failing, and when they finally broke completely, there would be no way to escape what was coming. Yet still the gods did not despair, for despair was not in their nature. They had been born from struggle, shaped by conflict, defined by their willingness to fight against impossible odds. If they were doomed to fall, they would fall as gods should fall, with defiance in their hearts and weapons in their hands. Their last breaths used to cry their battle songs into the face of oblivion. The end was coming, but it had not yet arrived. There was still time for glory, still time for heroism, still time to show that even doomed gods could face their fate with courage. The twilight of the gods was beginning, but twilight was not yet night, and in that fading light, there were still deeds to be done, still stories to be written in blood and fire across the darkening sky. When the final signs appeared, when the wolf swallowed the sun and the stars fell like tears from heaven, then would come the last battle, the one that would determine not whether the gods would die, but how they would die, and what their deaths would mean for whatever world might rise from the ashes of the old. The end began, as many endings do, not with a great cataclysm but with the breaking of a single bond. Deep beneath the earth, in the cave where he had lain for centuries, Loki felt his rage reach a crescendo that could no longer be contained. The earthquakes came more frequently now, each one stronger than the last, as his supernatural fury shook the very foundations of the world. Seijen, his faithful wife, had sat beside him all these years, catching what venom she could in her bowl, leaving his side only when the bowl was full and needed emptying. But even her devotion could not ease the agony that had transformed the trickster god into something far more dangerous than he had ever been when free. Each drop of the serpent's poison that struck his face fed the flames of his hatred, until that hatred became a force that could reshape reality itself. The moment came during the darkest hour of the Fimbulwinter, when the cold was so bitter that even the gods felt its bite. The earth convulsed with such violence that mountains cracked and valleys opened, and in that convulsion, the bonds that held Loki finally snapped. He rose from his prison like fire given form, his laughter echoing through all the 9 realms. Not the mischievous chuckle of old, but something terrible and mad that made the dead stir in their graves. His first act was to free his son Fenrir from the chains that had bound the great wolf since his youth. Gleipnir, the seemingly delicate cord that had proven stronger than any iron, parted like cobweb at Loki's touch. The wolf emerged from his captivity transformed, grown to such size that when he stood, his head touched the clouds, and when he howled, the sound shattered stone and stopped the hearts of lesser creatures. The bond between father and son, strained by years of imprisonment, was reforged in the flames of shared hatred. Together they called to Jormungandr, and the world's serpent answered, rising from the depths of the ocean in a maelstrom that drowned islands and sent tsunamis racing across the known world. The 3 children of... From the east came the ship Naglfar, built from the fingernails of the dead, its hull gleaming with a pale light that hurt the eyes of the living. Loki took his place at its prow, and behind him marched an army of giants, monsters, and the dishonored dead. From Muspelheim came Surtur with his flaming sword, leading the sons of fire in a column that turned the very air to flame. From Jotunheim came the frost giants, ancient and implacable, their hatred of the gods forged in the earliest days of the world. The gods in Asgard felt the approach of their enemies like a physical weight pressing down upon them. The light of the realm began to dim as darkness gathered on all horizons. Yet they did not flee or hide or seek to bargain with their foes. Instead, they made ready for battle with the calm efficiency of warriors who had always known this day would come. Odin donned his golden armor and took up Gungnir, the spear that never missed its target. Upon his head he placed his helm, and at his side stood his wolves Jerry and Freki, their eyes burning with reflected fire. The All-Father had sacrificed much for wisdom, and that wisdom told him that defeat was certain, but it also told him that the manner of that defeat would echo through whatever ages followed. Thor girded himself with his belt of strength and grasped Mjolnir in his mighty hand. The hammer sang with anticipation, for it would at last face the enemy it was destined to destroy and be destroyed by. The thunder god's red beard bristled with the electricity that coursed through his divine frame, and lightning played around his head like a crown of storm. Freyr stood ready with his golden boar Gullinbursti, but his heart was heavy, for he had traded away his magic sword long ago for the chance to woo the giantess Geir. He would face the final battle armed only with the antler of a stag, brave but doomed against the forces that marched against them. His sister Freyja prepared her falcon cloak and chose her greatest warriors from among the dead, but even her cedar magic could not alter the fate that rushed toward them. The Einherjar assembled in the courtyard of Valhalla, their ranks stretching beyond sight. These heroes of Midgard, gathered from centuries of battle, formed the core of the gods' army. They had fought and died once for glory, and now they would do so again, but this time their deaths would be final. There would be no Valhalla to receive them, no halls of the slain to welcome their spirits, for Valhalla itself would burn with everything else. As the armies of chaos approached the borders of Asgard, cosmic phenomena began to manifest that had not been seen since the creation of the world. The sun, pursued ever more closely by the wolf's goal, began to grow pale and cold, its light flickering like a candle in a gale. The moon, chased by Hati, became erratic in its course, sometimes appearing in the wrong quarter of the sky, sometimes vanishing entirely for days at a time. The stars began to fall from their appointed places, streaking across the darkness like tears of fire. Each falling star was a minor deity dying, a spirit of place or purpose being extinguished as the old order collapsed. The very fabric of reality was unraveling, and the careful structure the gods had built from Ymir's corpse was returning to the chaos from which it had emerged. Bifrost, the rainbow bridge, began to glow with ominous light as the armies of the gods marched across it toward the final battlefield. The bridge groaned under the weight of so many warriors, its crystalline structure beginning to crack and splinter. But it held, for it too had a role to play in the final drama, and it would not fail until that role was complete. The battlefield chosen for Ragnarok was VGRR, a plain so vast that it could accommodate all the forces of order and chaos that would clash there. 100 leagues it stretched in every direction, and its soil had never known the touch of plow or seed. It was a place outside the normal geography of the world, existing specifically for this moment, this final confrontation that would determine the fate of existence itself. The gods took their positions on the field with the precision of veterans who had fought together for millennia. Odin would face Fenrir, the wolf who had once been fed by Tyr's own hand. Thor would battle Jormungandr, the serpent whose poison had always been his destined doom. Freyr would stand against Surtur, armed only with courage and the antler he wielded like a sword. Tyr, the one-handed god of war and justice, would fight Garm, the hound of hell who guarded the gates of the dead. As the two armies faced each other across the plain, a strange silence fell. The wind died, the very air seemed to hold its breath, and for a moment that lasted an eternity, nothing moved on Vigir. Then Odin raised Gungnir high above his head, its point gleaming with the light of dying stars, and cast it over the enemy host in the ritual gesture that began all battles. The spear flew straight and true, passing over the heads of the assembled giants and monsters, marking them all for death and glory. As it completed its arc and returned to the Allfather's hand, the silence shattered like glass, and with a roar that shook the roots of Yggdrasil, the final battle of the gods began. What followed was not merely combat, but the unmaking of creation itself. When gods fought giants, when order battled chaos, when the foundations of reality were used as weapons, the very nature of existence trembled. The sky cracked like an egg, revealing darkness beyond darkness beneath its shell. The earth split and heaved, mountains falling into sudden chasms, new peaks rising where valleys had been moments before. Odin and Fenrir met at the center of the battlefield, and their struggle was like the collision of worlds. The wolf's jaws were so vast that they could swallow armies, his claws so sharp that they could rend the fabric between realms. But Odin was the king of the Aesir, master of war and wisdom, and though he was doomed to fall, he would not die easily. Gungnir struck again and again, each thrust drawing black blood from the wolf's hide, but Fenrir seemed to grow larger with each wound, fed by the pain and rage that had sustained him through his long captivity. When the wolf's jaws finally closed around the All-Father, crushing the wise god who had sacrificed so much for knowledge, Odin's last act was to drive his spear deep into Fenrir's heart. But even as he died, Odin knew that his death was not the end but the beginning of something new. His ravens, Hugin and Munin, took flight from his shoulders and soared high above the battlefield, carrying with them all the memories and wisdom the All-Father had gathered. They would survive the flames and tell the stories of this day to whatever minds arose in the world to come. Thor's battle with Jormungandr shook the very pillars of heaven. The world serpent rose from the poisoned seas like a mountain of scales and malice, his breath so toxic that it killed everything for leagues around. But Thor was the protector of Midgard, the giant killer, the god who had never known defeat in single combat. Mjolnir struck the serpent's head with the force of falling stars, cracking scales the size of shields, driving the monster back step by step across the ravaged plain. But for every blow Thor landed, Jormungandr's venom spread further, poisoning the air, the ground, the very light itself. When the thunder god finally struck the killing blow, shattering the serpent's skull and ending its ancient threat to the world, he had breathed so much poison that his own death was assured. Thor managed 9 steps away from his fallen enemy before the venom stopped his mighty heart. He fell with Mjolnir still clutched in his hand, the hammer's light dimming as its master died. But his sacrifice had not been in vain. Never again would the Midgard serpent threaten the realm of men, for that realm and serpent alike would soon exist only in memory. Across the battlefield, other duels reached their climactic moments. Freyr fought with desperate courage against Surtur, his makeshift antler sword flashing as he sought to find some weakness in the fire giant's defenses. But Surtur's flaming blade was inexorable, forged from the first fires that had burned in Muspelheim since the beginning of time. When it struck Freyr down, the god of peace and prosperity died as he had lived, protecting others even when that protection meant his own destruction. Tyr faced Garm in a battle that embodied the conflict between justice and chaos. The one-handed god fought with skill and determination, but the Hound of Hell was strengthened by the proximity of so much death. In the end, they slew each other simultaneously, justice and chaos canceling each other out in a moment of perfect, terrible balance. As the gods fell one by one, their deaths created wounds in reality itself. The carefully maintained order that had governed the 9 realms since their creation began to collapse. Natural laws failed, physical constants became variables, and the very concepts that defined existence started to blur and merge. Surtur, having defeated Freyr and seeing that the god's army was broken, raised his flaming sword high above his head. The blade blazed with the heat of a dying star, and when he swung it in a great arc across the sky, it ignited the world tree itself. Yggdrasil, the ash that had stood at the center of all creation, began to burn. The flames that consumed the world tree were not ordinary fire but cosmic force made manifest. They burned not just wood and leaf but meaning itself, consuming the connections between realms, the bonds between concepts, the very structure that held existence together. As the great ash tree blazed, its death fire spread to all the 9 realms, and everything the gods had built began to burn. Asgard burned, its golden halls collapsing into molten ruin. Midgard burned, its cities and fields and forests becoming funeral pyres for the hopes of men. Alfheim burned, the light elves consumed by light itself turned deadly. Jotunheim burned, the giants perishing in the same flames they had helped to kindle. Even Helheim burned, death itself dying in the cosmic conflagration. The fire spread beyond the realms to consume the very concepts they represented. Time burned, and past and future collapsed into an eternal, meaningless present. Space burned, and distance became negotiable, directions lost their meaning. Causality burned, and effects preceded causes. Stories told themselves backwards, heroes died before they were born. As the flames rose higher, they began to consume the gods themselves, not just their bodies but their very nature as divine beings. Odin's wisdom burned, becoming simple cunning, then animal instinct, then nothing at all. Thor's strength burned, becoming ordinary power, then weakness, then absence. Freyr's peace burned, becoming mere exhaustion, then conflict, then the silence of annihilation. But even as everything burned, something unexpected happened. The fire that consumed the old world began to purify as well as destroy. The lies and deceptions, the cruelties and injustices, the corruptions and compromises that had accumulated over the ages. All of these burned away, leaving behind only the essential truths that could not be destroyed. Love burned but was not consumed, for it had never been merely physical or even emotional but something deeper, something that existed in the spaces between souls. Courage burned but was not consumed, for it had never been merely the absence of fear but the choice to act rightly despite fear. Beauty burned but was not consumed, for it had never been merely appearance but the recognition of meaning in form. As Ragnarok reached its climax and the last flames licked at the dying embers of creation, something else stirred in the depths of the cosmic fire. Seeds that had been planted long ago, stories that had been told in preparation for this moment, hopes that had been preserved against the certainty of despair. All of these began to sprout in the fertile ashes of the old world. The end was not the end, for Norse mythology was cyclical, not linear. Ragnarok was twilight, not midnight, and after the longest night, dawn would come again. But that dawn would shine on a world reborn, a cosmos cleansed by fire and flood, where new gods would walk and new stories would be told. The Voluspa had spoken truly. The gods would die and the world would burn, but from those ashes, a new earth would rise, green and fair, where pain would be forgotten and evil would have no power. It would be a world worth the price that had been paid for it, worth the sacrifice of gods and heroes, worth the sorrow of endings and the hope of beginnings. But first, there had to be the burning. First, there had to be the end. And so the flames rose higher, consuming the last remnants of the old world, preparing the ground for whatever would grow in the garden that would bloom from its ashes. The twilight of the gods was ending, and the long night of transition had begun. From the ashes of Ragnarok, something stirred. Not immediately, for the fire had to burn itself out completely before anything could grow in its wake. The flames that had consumed gods and giants, heroes and monsters, the very foundations of reality itself, gradually diminished from cosmic inferno to smoldering embers to cold, dark ash that drifted in the void where once the 9 realms had been. For a time unmeasurable, for time itself had burned and was slowly reconstituting. There was nothing but the silence that follows the end of all things. No wind stirred the ashes, no light pierced the darkness, no sound echoed in the emptiness. It was not the chaotic void of Ginnungagap that had preceded creation, but something different. The peaceful silence of completion, of a story told to its end, of a circle closed. Yet even in that silence, the seeds of renewal were stirring. The Volva had prophesied truly when she spoke to Odin of what lay beyond the flames. I see a second earth, green and fair, rising from the waters. Cataracts cascade. The eagle soars above them, hunting fish on the mountainside. The first sign of the new world was water, not the poisonous flood that had drowned the old earth, but clear springs that bubbled up from depths untouched by the conflagration. These springs would form rivers, and the rivers would nurture valleys, and in those valleys new life would take root. The water was the tears of the world, shed for what had been lost, transformed by grief into the possibility of what might be gained. From the roots of the burned world tree came new growth. Yggdrasil had seemed to perish in the flames, but its roots had gone deeper than fire could reach, drawing nourishment from sources that existed before creation and would exist after its ending. A new ash sprouted from the old trunk, its branches reaching tentatively toward a sky that was slowly remembering how to be blue. As the new tree grew, it began to shelter life once more. 2 humans emerged from its trunk, having hidden there during the burning of the world. Their names were Lif and Lefracer, life and life's yearning, and they were the progenitors of the new race of mortals that would inherit the reborn earth. Unlike their predecessors, they had witnessed the end of the old world, had seen the price of unchecked ambition and unresolved hatred, and they carried that knowledge with them as they stepped into the light of a gentler sun. For the sun too had been reborn. Before her death in Skoll's jaws, Sol had given birth to a daughter even more beautiful than herself. This new sun rose in the east with light that was warmer and more golden than before, illuminating a world washed clean by fire and flood. Her rays touched everything with blessing, and wherever they fell, flowers bloomed and rivers sang, and the very stones seemed to pulse with quiet joy. The moon too had been renewed. Mani's daughter took up her father's burden, but she ran her course without fear, for the wolves that had pursued the heavenly bodies through all the ages of the old world had perished in the flames of Ragnarok. Night and day succeeded each other in natural rhythm, unmarked by the terror of endless chase. Not all the gods had perished in the final battle. A few survived, changed by what they had witnessed, chastened by loss but strengthened by hope. Vidar and Vali, sons of Odin, emerged from the ruins of Asgard carrying their father's wisdom, but not his desperate need to control fate. They had learned that some things must be allowed to run their course, that endings could be beginnings in disguise. Modi and Magni, Thor's sons, found their father's hammer Mjolnir among the ashes and lifted it together, for neither alone possessed their father's strength, but together they could wield the weapon that had defended Midgard for so long. They understood that protection was not a duty for one hero but a responsibility to be shared among all who had the strength to bear it. Baldr returned from Helheim, no longer the innocent god of light he had been before his death, but something deeper and more complex. He had walked in the realm of the dead, had seen what lay beyond the veil of life, and that knowledge had transformed him into a deity of resurrection rather than mere beauty. With him came Hr, his brother who had unknowingly caused his death, and their reconciliation became the first act of healing in the new world. The gods who survived were fewer than before but wiser, their divine nature tempered by loss and limitation. They built new halls, simpler than the grand palaces of old Asgard, places designed for council rather than display, for sharing rather than ruling. They had learned that power without wisdom led to destruction, that wisdom without humility led to pride, and that pride had been the fatal flaw that brought down the previous age. But the most remarkable change was in the relationship between gods and mortals. In the old world, the Aesir had ruled from on high, intervening in mortal affairs according to their own purposes, demanding sacrifice and worship as the price of their protection. In the new world, the surviving gods walked more humbly, offering guidance rather than commands, serving as teachers and friends rather than distant masters. Lif and Freyr established the first settlement of the New Age at the foot of the World Tree, and their descendants spread across the green earth, building communities based not on conquest and dominance but on cooperation and mutual aid. They remembered the stories of the old world, the tales of heroes and monsters, gods and giants, but they told them now as cautionary tales, reminders of paths not to be taken. The new race of mortals was not without conflict, for such was the nature of conscious beings in a world of limited resources and unlimited desires. But their conflicts were smaller, more easily resolved, marked by a wisdom born from the knowledge that all things could end if hatred were allowed to grow unchecked. They had inherited the memory of Ragnarok, and that memory served as both warning and protection. Magic still existed in the new world, but it was subtler, gentler, more closely tied to the natural rhythms of growth and decay, birth and death, love and loss. The harsh cedar that had once commanded the very forces of fate gave way to simpler arts. The ability to hear the speech of animals, to encourage plants to grow, to find what was lost, to heal what was wounded. Power was measured not by the ability to destroy but by the capacity to create and nurture. The giants too were transformed in the new dispensation. Some had perished completely in the flames of Ragnarok, their ancient hatred finally consuming them entirely. But others survived, changed by the experience of universal destruction into something more thoughtful, more reflective. They no longer sought to tear down the ordered world, but instead became its guardians, protectors of wild places and ancient wisdom, bridges between the civilized realm of mortals and the untamed power of nature. Loki did not return, for his role in the cosmic drama had been completed. He had been the catalyst of change, the necessary chaos that broke down the old order so that something new could arise. His sacrifice, for sacrifice it had been, despite its unwilling nature, had purged the world of accumulated corruption and made rebirth possible. He lived on only in memory, in stories that reminded all who heard them that even love could become destructive if it curdled into possessiveness, that even loyalty could become toxic if it hardened into blind obedience. As the new world settled into its rhythms, as mortals learned to live with gods who walked among them as equals rather than rulers, as the lessons of the old age were absorbed and integrated into daily life, something remarkable happened. The stories themselves began to change, not in their essential truth but in their meaning and application. The tale of Odin's sacrifice for wisdom became a reminder that knowledge without compassion was mere cleverness, that true wisdom required understanding of both power and its proper limits. The story of Thor's battles became a teaching about the difference between necessary defense and aggressive violence, about the importance of protecting the innocent without becoming a bully oneself. Baldr's death and resurrection became the central mystery of the new faith that gradually developed among the reborn mortals. Not a religion of fear and appeasement like some of the cults of the old world, but a recognition that death and rebirth were natural parts of existence, that loss made love more precious, that endings made beginnings possible. The great sagas of heroes like Sigurd were retold with new emphasis on the consequences of choices, the price of glory, the importance of considering not just immediate desires but long-term effects on family and community. They remained stirring tales of courage and adventure, but they also became guides for living in a world where actions had permanent consequences. Even the story of Ragnarok itself was transformed in the telling. No longer was it merely a tale of cosmic destruction, of gods and giants destroying each other in futile rage. It became instead a story of necessary change, of the price of renewal, of the courage required to let go of what was familiar in order to make space for what was better. The new world was not perfect. Perfection was not possible for beings who possessed both consciousness and freedom of choice. But it was better than the old world in fundamental ways. Violence still occurred but was less common and more quickly reconciled. Deception still happened but was more easily recognized and forgiven. Death still came but was accepted as part of a larger pattern rather than feared as final defeat. Most importantly, the new world was sustainable. The cycle that had led from order to chaos to destruction and back to order had been broken, not by preventing change but by learning to guide it more wisely. The inhabitants of the reborn earth understood that their world would also end someday, but they had confidence that its ending could be a transformation rather than a catastrophe, a graduation rather than a failure. And so the great wheel of story completed its turn. What had begun in ice and fire, in the void of Ginnungagap and the dreams of sleeping giants, had passed through ages of glory and terror, wisdom and folly, love and hatred, to arrive at last at a new beginning that contained all the best of what had come before while leaving behind the worst. The myths lived on, but they lived as guides rather than chains, as inspiration rather than commands, as reminders of possibilities both glorious and terrible that lay within the hearts of all conscious beings. They had become what all true myths must ultimately become. Not literal histories but eternal truths, stories that spoke to the deepest needs of the soul while acknowledging the complexity of existence. The world tree grew tall and strong once more, its branches reaching into realms that had been reborn cleaner and more beautiful than before. In its shade, the children of Lif and Lefracer learned the old stories from their parents, who had learned them from the gods themselves. But these children heard them with new ears, understanding them as metaphors for internal struggles rather than external battles, as guides for personal growth rather than calls to conquest. The runes that Odin had learned through pain and sacrifice were still carved on stone and wood, but their meanings had deepened. Where once they had been used to bind oaths that could destroy those who broke them, now they served to remind mortals of their connections to each other and to the natural world. The symbols that had once commanded fate now simply acknowledged it, helping those who studied them to understand their place in the great pattern of existence. In the new halls that rose beside the world tree, art flourished as it never had in the old world. The skaldic poetry that had once glorified war and conquest evolved into verse that celebrated the subtle heroisms of daily life. The courage to forgive an enemy, the strength to help a neighbor, the wisdom to know when to act and when to wait. The greatest bards were no longer those who could craft the most complex kennings about battlefield glory, but those who could find beauty in the ordinary moments that made up a life well lived. Storytelling became the highest of arts, and the greatest storytellers were those who could weave the old tales into new patterns, finding fresh meaning in familiar narratives, helping each generation discover how the ancient wisdom applied to their own challenges and choices. The stories of gods and giants, heroes and monsters, became frameworks for understanding human nature rather than distant legends of supernatural beings. As centuries passed in the New World, the memory of Ragnarok began to fade from immediate consciousness while remaining present in the deep structures of thought and culture. The people of the reborn Earth lived with a quiet awareness that their world too would someday end, but they had learned the secret that had eluded their predecessors: that endings need not be catastrophes if they were faced with wisdom and courage. This knowledge changed everything about how they lived. Instead of grasping desperately at permanence, they learned to appreciate the temporary nature of all things, finding in that temporariness not cause for despair but reason for gratitude. A flower was more beautiful because it bloomed for only a season, a friendship more precious because it could not last forever, a moment of joy more meaningful because it would pass. They built their cities and cultures with this understanding, creating institutions that could adapt and change rather than rigid hierarchies that would eventually collapse under their own weight. Their laws were written as principles rather than absolute rules, allowing for flexibility and growth while maintaining the essential structures that allowed civilization to function. Their relationships with the surviving gods reflected this new wisdom. The divine beings were honored and respected, but they were not feared or blindly obeyed. They were seen as elder siblings in the family of consciousness, beings who had lived longer and learned more but who were still growing and changing themselves. The distance between mortal and divine had not disappeared, but it had become a difference of degree rather than kind. In this atmosphere of mutual respect and shared growth, new forms of wisdom emerged. The harsh dichotomies of the old world, order versus chaos, good versus evil, life versus death, gave way to more nuanced understandings of reality as a complex interplay of complementary forces. The people of the New Age learned to see conflict not as something to be avoided at all costs, but as a necessary part of growth, provided it was engaged in with wisdom and restraint. They developed new arts of resolution, ways of handling disputes that honored the legitimate needs of all parties, while preventing the escalation that had characterized the old world's approach to conflict. They learned that strength could be shown through restraint as well as action, that sometimes the greatest victory was knowing when not to fight. The natural world, too, was different in the new dispensation. The harsh struggle for survival that had characterized existence in the old realms gave way to a more cooperative relationship between all living things. Predators still hunted prey, but there was a rhythm and balance to it that prevented any species from overwhelming the others. Humans learned to live as part of this balance rather than trying to dominate it, taking what they needed but always giving something back. Magic, when it appeared, was gentle and subtle, focused on healing and growth rather than destruction and dominance. The practitioners of these new arts understood that true power came not from forcing the world to bend to their will, but from learning to work in harmony with forces larger than themselves. They were gardeners of reality rather than its conquerors, nurturing and guiding rather than commanding and controlling. As the new world matured, its inhabitants began to develop their own myths, stories that grew from their direct experience rather than being handed down from earlier ages. These new tales spoke of different kinds of heroes, teachers who helped children learn to think for themselves, healers who cured not just bodies but communities, builders who created structures that enhanced rather than dominated their environments. But the old stories were not forgotten. They were preserved and studied, not as literal truths to be believed, but as profound explorations of the possibilities and dangers inherent in consciousness itself. The tale of Odin's sacrifice for wisdom became a meditation on the price of knowledge and the responsibility it brought. The story of Thor's battles reminded listeners of the importance of protecting the innocent while warning against the dangers of solving every problem with force. The saga of Loki served perhaps the most important function of all, for it helped the people of the New World understand the shadow side of their own nature, the capacity for creativity and destruction that lay within every conscious being, the thin line between helpful mischief and harmful malice, the way love could transform into hate if it were not tended carefully. Most powerfully, the story of Ragnarok itself became a source of both warning and hope. It reminded each generation that their world, no matter how beautiful or perfect it seemed, was not eternal, that the price of continued existence was eternal vigilance against the pride and hatred that had destroyed the previous age. But it also promised that endings could be new beginnings, that even the most catastrophic destruction could become the foundation for something better. In the end, this was perhaps the greatest gift of the Norse myths. Not a simple moral code or a set of rules to follow, but a complex and nuanced exploration of what it meant to be conscious in a universe that was both beautiful and terrible, ordered and chaotic, meaningful and random. They offered no easy answers, but they provided tools for asking the right questions, ways of thinking about existence that honored both its glories and its tragedies. The gods of the North had been harsh teachers, demanding much and offering no guarantee of reward. But what they had taught, the importance of courage in the face of uncertainty, the value of wisdom even when it came at great cost, the necessity of accepting responsibility for one's choices and their consequences, these lessons had proven their worth in the crucible of cosmic destruction and renewal. And so the stories lived on, passed from generation to generation, not as dogma to be believed, but as wisdom to be pondered, not as history to be memorized, but as possibilities to be explored. They remained alive because they spoke to something eternal in the human spirit, the need to find meaning in suffering, beauty in loss, hope in endings. The world tree continued to grow, its roots reaching deep into the wisdom of the past, its branches stretching high toward futures yet unimagined. In its shade, children learned the old tales and began to dream new ones, adding their own voices to the great conversation that had begun in the void of Ginnungagap and would continue as long as consciousness endured. The gods had passed into legend, but their legacy lived on in every choice made with wisdom rather than impulse, every act of courage in the face of fear, every moment of beauty created in a world that seemed determined to destroy it. They had become what they had always been meant to be, not rulers of reality, but its most eloquent interpreters, voices that spoke from the depths of experience about what it truly meant to live, to love, to lose, and to endure. The fire had burned, the world had ended, and from its ashes had risen something new and better. The cycle was complete, but it was also just beginning, for in the nature of stories, true stories, mythic stories, the stories that matter, every ending is a doorway, every death a transformation, every twilight the promise of another dawn. And somewhere in the growing dusk, if you listen closely, you can still hear the echo of the old songs, the whisper of the ancient tales, reminding all who have ears to hear that courage matters, that beauty endures, that even gods must die so that life can continue, and that the greatest victory is not avoiding the end but meeting it with dignity, grace, and the unshakable conviction that some things, love, honor, the willingness to sacrifice for others, are worth preserving even at the cost of everything else. The story ends, but it never truly ends, for it lives now in those who have heard it, in the choices they will make, in the courage they will show, in the love they will give and receive. The gods may be gone, but their greatest creation, the stories themselves, remain eternal as long as there are minds to hold them and hearts brave enough to live by their light. Good night.